Hello, fellow plantophiles. So there are different names based on how old something is. For example, it could be new, vintage, semi-antique, antique, ancient. So, when it comes to something new, it's something that's fairly recently made, something brand new on the market. When it comes to vintage, you typically, like if you look online, there are going to be slight deviations in range of how old something has to be classified as vintage, semi-antique, antique, or ancient. And typically you would say something 20 to 25 years all the way up to about 40 or 50 years would be considered vintage. Now, recollect with cars, anything over 25 to 30 years is considered antique. So different fields will have different ages as well. And vintage is typically a term that was borrowed from the wine industry. Anyway, when it comes to an object that's 40, 50 years, all the way up to about 75 to 90, they're typically referred to as semi-antique. Then when you get an object that's 90 to 100 years old or older, antique. Now, when it comes to ancient, I'm not exactly sure how old something has to be referenced as ancient, but typically if it's 400 or 500 years or older, it would be safe to reference as ancient. So, when it comes to antiques, you have the regular antiques, and then you have the mantiques. Like you have this vintage 1980s Kuwait oil beach chair, or these antique colonial lighting devices. The one on the left is an early 1700s Welsh rushlight, and the one to the right is a 1600s English cruise lamp, and these are two of the examples in my collection. And then you have something known as plantique. That's right, plantique. But what does plantique mean, And I would define it. I didn't really go ahead and look up the definition because just like mantique is like a manly antique, plantique would be like a plant-related antique, typically either antique for plants or an antique that's repurposed to use with your plants. Now, something that's for plants would be like these two vintage McCoy pottery examples. The one on the right, I think, is from the 60s. After I purchased this one, I found a square one like it on eBay that was claimed to be from the 60s. And it's not that common to find exact styles. If you know of any book that focuses on McCoy pottery, please leave a comment with it. I'd greatly appreciate that. And then you also have antiques which you can repurpose. For example, this wall-mounted coffee grinder that I repurposed with a macrame, or you have other mounted coffee grinders like another wall-mounted one or one that mounts to the table that you can plant plants in, or even a wall-mounted coffee grinder that you can convert into a terrarium. Now with antiques, I have a couple antique bottles. The one on the left has been made into a lamp. It's from the 1800s, and there are methods of identifying antique bottles versus new ones based on how the glass appears to have been made. If it was blown, it would be really old, and then around the 1850s to 1900s, maybe even 1830s, don't quote me on it, they would be blown, hand blown, but into a mold, so they would still have a seam coming down the side, but then they would put the top on and the top wouldn't have a seam. And then this 1910s French wine bottle, the Demijohn bottle on the right, that is basically machine blown into a mold because the seam of the bottle goes all the way up to the lip. Now, you also have other things you can use to display your plants, like this semi-antique. It's from 1953 postal scale, and you can easily use it to mount a vintage mug with a plant in it, or another plant that you can basically put on there. And then what's nice is you can always see the weight on the scale to know when it's time to water. I thought of trying to do that and see how well that would be for certain plants. Now, with reference to the mug that has a string of hearts in, that pedestal is just a cheap brand new one from Michael's. It's not like an antique Betty lamp stand or anything like that, but it's still nice to use for plants. Now, also you have newer items that you can couple with antiques. Like you have these nice brand new bird bath type plant stands, and you can mount in them. Like here's one where my mom has a beautiful pothos in it, but you can also basically use these brass pots that are made by Bedouins in Arabia that are like hand beaten, and they're basically copper on the outside filled with solder on the inside, and you can have it nice and shining, and it gives you a nice antique with new kind of scheme, but they complement each other so well. And then you have this vintage made in Mexico plant stand, which I bought a newer pot, and I still have yet to fully pot that philodendron Prince of Orange in it, but hopefully soon. Fingers crossed. Now, here's something else that's really interesting. Let's talk about plantiquities, or plantiques that are made with things using antiquities. Like for example, I have these 3 really early, and when I say really early, you're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 year old lamps. And all 3 of these are from the land of Canaan. And the one on the left that looks more like an ashtray is essentially the earliest style. Basically, before the lamp was invented like a device to be used as a lamp, lamps were typically depressions in stones or seashells, or they would take small saucers that they would eat in, similar to the one in the center, but then archaeologists could tell which ones were used as lighting because of the burn that you can see in the edge on the side of the saucer. Then they started folding them over and they look like this ashtray. Now, the ashtray one is essentially from the days of Abraham. And you can basically use it as put a small plant in it for decor if you want to, but to put something worth a few $100s and risk having a child or dog or something destroy it, is it safe? But you can do something like that with plantiquities, or if you have like an ancient Phoenician amphora, But what's interesting about this, the 4 valve cruise lamp from ancient times, is how Abraham was sent from Ur of the Chaldees. He went up to Haran and then went down into Canaan. So he basically followed the Fertile Crescent from Babylon, or just south of Babylon, up and this way, because you wouldn't go straight west because you'd be crossing the Syrian desert and it's not safe. It's better to go up where the water sources are. So anyway, he essentially went east to west. Just as God created the universe, which the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, as mentioned on day 4 in Genesis chapter 1. And so out of the seed of Abraham came the light of the world. So basically he was sent to Canaan. He was sent west and out of his seed came the light of the world, and then to spread the gospel to the 4 corners of the world. And here you have the first style lamp. Basically, you had 4 wicks to send light to the 4 corners of the room. It's just a little bit of biblical trivia mixed with history that you wouldn't hear your average preacher mention on the pulpit, because it's something I realize I haven't really read that anywhere, but it's just because I'm interested in early lighting. And then the one on the center, you could basically, put a small plant in it, like a tiny trailing plant. And then the one on the right is from the days of the Exodus. And it's bigger, it looks like a clamshell, or some people refer to as a witch's hat, but the later ones were a little more elaborate with a base, so I think those would be more like the witch's hat. I'm not too sure. I focus more on the colonial lighting, but yeah, you could use ancient stuff too and have some plantiquities in addition to plantiques. And just looking at my checklist, yes, I have this vintage aftermarket 1920s, well, now it would be about antique, close to 100 years old, that I mounted in this beautiful wood plaque. So that's something you can do. You can also get basically sewing machine drawers and design them like this one here, where you can mount it on the wall and put plants in it in pots. You can, let's see, I'm just looking at my screen or my cheat sheet, and I think that about sums it. You can take crock pots, put plants in it like this ficus elasticus, or elastica, I like to call it elasticus, and have it in a plant stand. And there are just so many ways of repurposing antiques, or antiquities even, to beautify your home with wonderful plants. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to stay privy on all my upcoming videos on plants. Thanks for watching and happy planting!